What's up everybody? Welcome to Coding with Chaim. In this week's video, we're going to be taking a look at Node.js. So we're going to be covering the sort of fundamental concepts within the sort of Node ecosystem, and then we're actually going to go ahead and build a simple Node REST API powered by a SQL database. One thing I do want to point out before we actually jump into this is that I'm assuming that you're already comfortable with JavaScript, because this is of course a Node tutorial and not so much a JavaScript tutorial, so I'm assuming that you're already comfortable with JavaScript as a language. So with that introduction out of the way, let's get into this. So the first step that we need to take is, of course, to make sure that we have Node installed in our machines. So in order to do that, what we can do is we can navigate on over to nodejs.org, a link to which you'll find down in the description box below. And then when we actually come to the site, we're going to be prompted with the sort of buttons to download the correct Node version depending on our sort of operating system. So of course, since I'm on a Mac, it's already prompted me to download for my Mac. But if you're on a Windows or on a Linux, it'll basically prompt you accordingly. Now you may notice that you're given a choice of these two buttons, whether you want to install the LTS version or the current version. The difference only is that the current version has the sort of most bleeding edge features, and the LTS version is kind of like the latest stable version. But for the sake of what we're trying to do, whichever version you want to use is totally fine. Personally, I have the latest stable version currently installed, but it really doesn't make much of a difference. You can choose whichever one you want. So click on the button of whichever one you want to install, go ahead and follow the prompts. Very straightforward. It should only take but a minute or two, and then you'll have Node installed on your machine. So now once your installation is done, let's head on over to our terminal and let's run the command node-v just like so. And as you can see, when I ran that, I got the output of exactly which version it is that I have installed on my machine of Node. Now, honestly, I don't really care too much about specifically which version it is that I have installed, but what this does tell me is that I do in fact have Node installed on my machine. So now you've basically gone through the process of trying to install Node. A nice way to kind of verify, and an easy way to verify that the installation went off without a hitch, is to go into your terminal and then simply run this command node-v. And if you get an output of the version of Node that's been installed, you then know that Node was successfully installed. But if it wasn't successfully installed, you're presumably going to get some kind of error saying that the Node command isn't found. So when you install Node on your machine, one of the sort of different tools that kind of comes along with that installation is the Node package manager, or more commonly referred to as NPM. So NPM is basically this tool that lets us do multiple different things. So the two things that are most commonly done with NPM is A, do we want to go ahead and install third-party libraries from the NPM registry. So in other words, when you're writing your Node application, you might want to go ahead and reach for some kind of third-party library from GitHub that you want to use within your application. Using NPM, the sort of Node package manager, allows you to actually go ahead and install those packages within your project. In addition to that, NPM also gives us some kind of commands that we can run to kind of help our Node workflow. One such command that we're going to be using right now is the init command. So as it is right now, this folder that I'm navigated on over to, the CWC cars folder that I have open right now, is currently not actually a Node project. So let's go ahead and change that. And the way that we're going to change that is by simply saying npm init -y. So the init command is the one that actually goes ahead and initializes a new Node project. So again, we're using this npm tool that came along with our Node installation. We're then calling its init command, and then we're passing in the -y flag. And all the -y flag basically does, it kind of just says yes to all the questions that we typically get asked when we go ahead and bootstrap a new Node project. So again, all npm init does is it kind of turns this simple, regular, mundane folder into a Node project. So let's hit enter and see what happens. Okay, so now that we hit enter, we can see that we get some kind of output. We see that we have this new file called package.json. Let's go ahead and open up this particular folder now in our editor of choice, which for me is going to be VS Code, and let's inspect this package.json a little bit more closely. So here we are now in the editor. We have the package.json file open, and as you can see, it has the sort of the name of the project, the version of the project, the description if you choose to give it some kind of a description, the main file, the kind of entry point, and again, all these values were given by default by the fact that I said -y. Had I not have said -y, it would have kind of prompted me all along the way, like what's the name of the project, who's the author of the project, what's the version of the project, so on and so forth. And then in my command line, I could have answered all these questions. And in a real life project, you might want to do this, but for the sake of this tutorial, simply passing the -y flag is of course good enough, and then you can just choose the default values, which by the way, you can always just go into the package.json and then of course manually change the values if you so choose to. So now that we see this package.json, we don't really have a lot of insight about what it is that it actually does for us. So I think the best way to kind of see what the package.json really does for us within a Node project is to actually kind of take a bit of a detour first and go ahead and install the first library, the first sort of third-party module that we need in order to start building up our REST API. And so essentially, since we're going to be building a REST API, we have to kind of build up some kind of server that can listen out for requests on a certain port, and then of course go ahead and be able to respond to those incoming requests. So the tool of choice that I'm going to use for this particular project for our Node REST API is a tool called Express. So let's head on back over to our terminal and let's go ahead and look at another command that npm offers, and that's going to be the install command, which of course can also just be shorthanded to npm I, and then we're going to be passing it the name of the module that we want to install, and that in this case is going to be Express. So again, the command is simply npm, calling upon the npm tool, giving it the I command, which pretty much stands for install. install, and then after telling it which library do we want to install, and of course in this case, like I said, it's called Express, we hit enter, and then we let it install this library for us. So now that npm is done installing Express for us, if we come on back into our project, we're going to notice that aside from having the package.json, we have this new folder called Node modules. So essentially, every single time that you install something from the npm registry using this npm tool, essentially you're going to be getting this sort of bit of code, the actual code that is being given to you from GitHub or from the npm registry, and then that's going to get put into this Node modules folder. Now, I want to actually show you something interesting. As it is right now, the only thing that I installed was Express, but despite that, when I actually go ahead and open up the Node modules folder, you'll notice that there's at least 30 to 40 folders already in here within the Node modules folder, and this only happened due to the fact that I went ahead and installed Express. And now this is going to start leading into why it is that we need the package.json in the first place. So here's the problem. Since Node modules is the kind of folder that can grow to be really, really big. In fact, there's some memes out on the internet where Node modules is like the heaviest object on the internet. If I can find it, I'll overlay it on the screen right now so you can actually go ahead and see that. But the basic idea is that Node modules can grow to insane weights, because every single library that you want to install just installs its dependencies and its dependencies, and it just grows insane. So now, because this Node modules is so big, we of course don't want to actually go ahead and check it into source control. But obviously that's now going to be posing a problem, because what happens if you have 2 or more developers working on a team, and then one developer actually goes in and installs a dependency, which now the project relies on its dependency to be able to work and function correctly. Now when the other person on the team tries to then go ahead and pull down the code, they're now not going to have the dependency, because again, we're not actually checking the dependencies, this Node modules folder, into the source control. It's not being put into Git. So now, how is the other person supposed to be able to run their code if they don't actually have the dependency installed? Well, it turns out that's exactly what the package.json is going to do for us. So if you now come back to the package.json, you'll notice that one of the additional fields that has been added for us by npm is going to be this dependencies section. So this dependency section is now, as you can see, is listing Express. And so now we can start to kind of see what the package.json is doing for us. Essentially, the way that we now can have our Node modules be source controlled without actually having to commit the actual Node modules folder is through using this dependencies section within the package.json. So this would basically be the flow. I would, let's say, work on a feature that requires me to go ahead and install another module. I will then install the module. It's going to show up inside of the dependency section within my package.json. I'm then going to go ahead and commit my work, push it back up to GitHub, and then my coworker can come and pull down. Now, of course, I didn't check it into Node modules. I only checked in the actual package.json that includes the list of the dependencies that I've installed. Now my coworker can then go ahead and pull down the work, and then I can tell them, by the way, I installed a new dependency. And then what that means for them is simply they can open up the project, going back to their terminal, and then simply run the command npmi without passing it any other name. Simply saying npmi or npm install is going to be enough. And then what that's going to do is Node is going to go ahead and scan the list of dependencies that have been specified within the dependency section of the package.json, compare that against what's currently not yet installed from within the Node modules, and anything that's missing would get installed just like that. So effectively, without actually going and checking in the Node modules to source control, we still have the concept of actually having source controlled modules within our project through the package.json's dependency section. And that's pretty much what the package.json does for us. Okay, so now that we actually have Express installed within our project, let's start writing the sort of basic code that we need to kind of start writing the server that we're ultimately going to end up using to kind of listen out for the requests for our REST API that we're going to be building down the line. So you'll now notice that I actually created a new file called server.js, and these few lines of code is all it takes to kind of build up a simple server that can now start listening out for actual requests and then be able to respond back to those requests to whoever's making the request. So let's examine this code. So already in line 1, you'll notice that we're saying const express is equal to require express. And there's a good chance that you're thinking, well, what exactly does require do? I've never actually seen that in browser-based code. So let me quickly explain what require actually does, since this is a sort of more Node-specific concept. It turns out that Node actually offers something called file-based scope. Essentially, when you're writing browser-based JavaScript, so you might have like one HTML file, and then on that HTML file, you might have a couple of link tags or a couple of script tags where you're kind of referencing different JavaScript files. So in the browser, despite the fact that you have multiple different JavaScript files, all of those files with all of those JavaScript files actually share the same scope because they're all linked to the same HTML file. And then what that means is if, let's say in file A, I might declare a variable const my variable, in file B, I then can't go ahead and once again declare const my variable because the variable already exists and I'm going to have a naming collision. Unless if I actually write my own function or write my own iffy or some kind of way create my own separate scope. But individually, the file itself, just because it's a separate file, does not in fact that create a separate scope. On the other hand, in Node, we actually have file-based scope, which means that if we have some kind of code that's written in one file, and then I have another file, one file scope does not share another file scope, which means if I have a variable declared my variable in file A, I can very safely then once again go ahead and write my variable in file B, and there's not going to be any naming collisions because each individual file creates its own module, and then basically every module has its own scope. Now the thing is, sometimes you might want to actually go ahead and reference code that lives within a different file or within a different module, and that's exactly where the require function comes into play. So essentially the require function can be used to either require something from within the node modules folder. In this case, we're actually requiring express. Express was installed for us by npm and then put into the node modules folder. So we kind of want to get that code out of the node modules folder, out of that express folder. So we're telling it to simply go to express and get that for us. Alternatively, require can also be used to kind of import or require our own local code. So let me show you a quick example of that. Okay, so let's take a look. So here I have a file called foo.js. In this file, I'm basically saying module.exports. I'm calling upon the sort of module object that gets passed into me, into my file. I'm calling its exports object, and I'm basically telling it, I want you to go ahead and export this function, and then all this function is going to do whenever somebody calls it is just log icon from another file. We then move on over to our bar file, which we've also just created, and then I'm saying const func is equal to require./foo. So the only difference between this require statement here and this require statement here is that here I'm not using any kind of relative path. I'm just specifying the name of the module, and then Node is going to go look into my node modules folder to find my module, whereas here in the bar file I'm actually specifying a relative path, and I'm saying go to ./foo, and that means that instead of going to the node modules folder, go look at my own individual file system and find my own relative path. So now if we actually go ahead and run the bar file, we can actually see that we get the output icon from another file. So it's all working exactly as expected. And that's basically what the require statement actually does. So now moving on further down the line of what we're doing within this particular file, we're basically saying that we're going to be getting this app object by calling this express. In other words, when we import express from the express module, express is basically like a factory function. When you call it, you're basically going to get this app object, and then this app object basically is your interface to start building up your entire server. So what we're doing here is we're pretty much specifying a get method off of this app object, and this get method is going to be listing out for the endpoint of /test. When we get a request to /test, we're going to have this callback function fire, which this callback function will receive a request object and response object, and then off of the response object we're going to be sending back a status code of 200 and then a JSON message of success is equal to true. And then down here on line 8 we're basically telling the express object of the app that it's going to be listening out on port 1337, and then when the server successfully starts up, this callback function here is just going to log to our terminal that the server is running on whatever port it is that we specified. So let's actually see this in action. So in order to actually run this, once again, we simply use the command node. In other words, now we're not going to use the npm command. We can if we want to by actually creating a script, and I'll demonstrate that in just a second. But for now, if you want to just be able to run a file, any kind of JavaScript file that lives in Node, you can just use the Node executable to actually go ahead and run those files. So in this case, we're going to be trying to run the server file. So we're going to say node server.js. That's going to bring up our server. And now if we actually go into the browser, go to localhost 1337/test, we should actually get the object of success is equal to true. So let's see that happen. So as you now notice, I've navigated on over to localhost 1337/test, and here you can see I'm getting back my JSON object of success is equal to true. So now, as I've mentioned, right now the way that I actually brought up this particular server, the way that I kind of started up my application was by actually calling upon the node command and then calling server and then telling it to run the server.js file. But as I said, we can also use npm to make that happen, and let me show you how. If you head on back over to your package.json, you'll notice that we have this section called scripts. So what we can do is we can create a new script called start, and then what we can tell the script to do is to very simply say node server.js. Now, if we come on back to our terminal, we'll hit Control-C to stop the process. And so now, instead of saying node server.js, we can actually say npm start, and it's going to do the exact same thing. So now we're actually calling upon npm to run our own local start command, and then what that start command is doing is actually going to go ahead and say node server.js, and then this is going to bring our application up and running. And now, once again, we could, if we want to, go to localhost 1337 and start listening out and start making some requests. So now that we actually have our server up and running, the next step to kind of get our REST API to work is to actually go ahead and set up our database. Now, before we actually jump into the actual database setup, I just want to point out very quickly that whatever I'm about to do with our particular database, and I'm going to be using SQLite, would just as easily be working if you're using MySQL or if you're using Postgres, and if you're on a Windows, you could even do this with SQL Server. So since I'm going to be using SQLite, the first thing I need to do is actually go ahead and create a SQLite file to kind of act as our database within this particular project. Okay, so I've basically created a new file called CWC, standing for Coding with Chaim. That's SQLite 3. So essentially all SQLite is, it's basically a file-based database. Now that we actually have this file set up, and we actually have our sort of database set up, we now have to actually have some kind of GUI that's going to let us manipulate this database and go ahead and add tables to it, and then of course the schema of those particular tables to this particular database. Now because I'm going to be using SQLite, I'm going to be using a tool called DB Browser, which is going to be the GUI that I'm going to be using to kind of actually manipulate my SQLite database. And if you want to actually be able to follow along, if you want to install this, I'll leave a download link down in the description box below where you can actually find the download link to go and install DB Browser, and you can install it for either Windows or Mac and potentially Linux also. I'm not entirely sure, but you can just follow the link and see if there's an option for you to install it on Linux as well. Okay, so I pretty much clicked on this open database button right over here. This brings up this sort of file explorer. I then navigated on over to CWC CRUD, which is a project that we're currently working in. And then as you can see right over here, we have the CWC SQLite 3 file. We're going to go ahead and open, and now we basically have our actual database open within this GUI, and now we can actually start using the GUI to manipulate our database by adding tables to it, then of course adding a schema to that particular table. So I'm going to quickly speed through that, and I'll catch you when the actual setup of the database is done. Okay, so now as you can see, we now have a table called cars, and this table has a primary key that's going to be an ID. It's going to have a make, a model, and a year, and that's basically going to be the actual database and table already ready and set up. And now we can actually move on into the code and start writing the functions that we need in order to start being able to manipulate the data within this particular database. The next thing we need to do is head on back over to our terminal, and we're going to have to install 2 more dependencies to be able to start working with our database and start actually carrying out all the sort of basic CRUD operations against our database. That is, to be able to create, read, update, and delete cars within our database, we're going to have to install 2 more modules to kind of make that work. So as you can see, I'm once again calling upon the npm tool. I'm calling upon the Node package manager, and then I'm calling upon its I command, which basically stands for install. And this time, instead of only passing 1 dependency at a time, I can actually pass more than 1 dependency, and then it'll just install all dependencies that have been specified after the I command. So in this case, I'm installing something called connects. And connects will basically be the tool that will allow us to actually go ahead and execute our SQL statements against our database. And then under the covers, connects actually will be relying on SQLite 3. Since that's the database of choice that we're using here, we have to make sure that we have SQLite installed so that connects can go ahead and rely on it. Because as I mentioned, what we're doing doesn't only have to work against the SQLite database, it can just as easily work against a MySQL or a SQL Server or a Postgres, and all that's due to the fact that we're using this tool called connects. And the way that that works is you install connects, and then in addition to that, you install the driver that you want to use, but the syntax will basically be pretty much the same because connects is mostly a database agnostic tool that lets you execute SQL queries against a whole host of different SQL databases without really having to change your syntax. So let's hit enter and let both of these dependencies install. Okay, so now that our dependencies are done installing, let's head back on into the code and start writing the functions necessary to execute all these sort of CRUD operations against our cars table. Okay, so here's what I've done so far. As you can see, I've created a new folder called DB, and within this folder, all I've basically done so far is I've created a file called connects.js. And then within that file, I went ahead and imported connects by calling the require function again, passing the name of the module that I want to import, which in this case is just connects. So now by default, when you actually import connects, at this point, you don't yet have the ability to start using connects to execute queries against your database because you're not yet connected to your database. Connects doesn't quite know how to actually go ahead and connect to your database, which is why what we're doing here on line 3, we're actually saying we're calling the connects function, passing in this configuration object, and then what this is going to return to us is going to be a connected instance of connects, because within this object we're basically going to be passing this sort of configuration object of teaching it how to actually go ahead and connect to our database. So in this case we're just using SQLite, which makes it a lot simpler, but if you were using something like MySQL or Postgres or SQL Server, this is where you kind of be passing in your connection string to teach it how to go ahead and connect to your actual database. So in this case we're saying that the client of choice that we're going to be using is going to be SQLite, and then the connection here in this case is just going to be the fact that we're going to be going to a file called cwc.sqlite3. Now the next thing that I've done is I've actually gone ahead and created a new file within the DB folder called cars.js. And what you'll notice here now is I'm actually going and I'm importing connects from require./connect. So you see now I'm using a relative path, which means I'm going to my own local file here, going to this connects file. And what I'm trying to import is I'm trying to import my own connected instance of connects, which means I don't want to use the actual module at this point because that one doesn't actually have the ability to go ahead and connect to my database. At this point, I'm trying to use the connected version of it. And that's why over here, if you come back to my cars file, I'm saying ./connects, go to my own relative file and get me what that file is going and exporting towards me. And then here, these are all very, very self-explanatory. All I've really done is I've created the sort of 4 functions to allow me to go ahead and execute the sort of 4 basic operations against my cars table. So I've got the ability to go ahead and create a car, which will accept a car object. It's then going to return the promise that connects returns. So whenever you call a connects function against your database, it's going to go ahead and return a promise. So we're going to actually just take that promise and return it onward to whoever's actually going to be going to call this function. And so all of a sudden, connects of the table cars, go ahead and call the insert method, passing in the car object. Then down here, we're going to go to the get all cars method, which is going to go to the cars table, select everything from it. Delete car is going to be accepting an ID. It's going to then go ahead and say that where the ID is equal to the ID that's being passed in, we're going to go ahead and call the delete method. And then update car works kind of in a similar fashion. We're going to be accepting the ID of the one that we want to update, as well as the car itself, the sort of new values for that particular car. We're going to go ahead and say connects of the cars table, where the ID is equal to the one that's currently being passed in. I want you to go ahead and update the car. And then finally down here on line 19, we're basically saying module.exports. We're going to be exporting an object. This object is going to be having 4 keys, and these keys are pretty much just nothing more than the actual functions that we've gone ahead and just created right now to be able to execute SQL commands against our cars table. So finally, the last thing we really need to do at this point is actually just go ahead and build up our actual Express endpoints to be able to listen out for the incoming request and then go ahead and call the corresponding function depending on which endpoint is getting hit. So let's do that now. Okay, so let me walk you through what I've just done. So you'll notice right over here on line 3, I'm actually going and I'm importing this DB object, which again references that object that has those keys on it, the sort of db.cars, right? So in other words, if I can do db.create car, db.delete car, get all cars, right? So in other words, we actually go to the /db folder, and within that folder, we're going to the actual cars file. We're going to be importing the sort of object that folder, that file is going to be exporting for us. And that's going to be the object that contains those individual keys, where each key represents a function to execute some kind of SQL against our cars table. And then down here, what we're basically starting to do is just specifying the sort of 4 necessary endpoints to go ahead and handle the 4 basic operations that we want to have on our cars table. So let's walk through each one. Very simply over here, I'm making a post request to /cars. The callback function that I'm passing to /cars is marked with the async keyword, which will then allow me to actually use the await keyword within the actual callback function. And then what we're doing is we're basically saying db.createCar, passing in rec.body. Now, right over here, I do want to already point out that we are currently in trouble. As it is right now, we don't actually have a fully working REST API just yet, because as it turns out, when you're actually using Express, by default, when you're actually sort of accepting some kind of post request, or even if it's a patch or a put or whatever, something that includes a body, by default Express doesn't actually have the sort of ability to extract the data that lives within that body. And so what's going to end up happening is when you actually try to call upon the request object, calling upon its body key, the body is going to just be an empty object, and it's not actually going to have the data that you kind of pass along within your post request. Now, there's actually a way to solve this, and the way to solve this is by installing a tool called body parser. So let me actually go ahead and quickly install body parser and show you very quickly how we use it. So once again, we're going to be calling upon the npm tool, calling upon its I command, the install command, and we're going to say that we wanted to install body parser. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the additional code that I've just added. So if we come back now to line 3, you'll now notice that I'm actually importing body parser by saying require body parser. And then here on line 6 and 7, you'll see that I'm actually saying app.use body parser the URL encoded. I'm basically telling Express I'm going to let body parser teach you how to parse any requests that are of the type URL encoded. And then on line 7, I'm basically telling Express that I'm going to let body parser teach you how to go ahead and parse the sort of JSON body. Now, I'm not going to dive too deep into what this is actually doing and how this actually works, but this is basically known as the concept of Express middleware. And so all you need to know for the sake of this video is that essentially by the time we now actually are going to get to our app.post, you're going to go to the /cars. At this point, rec.body, instead of actually being an empty object, is actually going to be the object that you actually passed in along with your actual post request. And that's all thanks to the fact that we're saying app.use body parser.url encoded, body parser.json. Essentially, this sort of middleware, this app.use that's going to be accepting the body parser function will actually allow Express to now learn and understand how to actually go ahead and parse the body out. So therefore, by the time we actually get to our actual endpoint, rec.body, instead of it being an empty object, is of course going to be the actual values that we actually went ahead and passed along with our post request. Now, I understand that that's kind of vague, but that's all I'm going to say for the sake of this particular video. If you'd like to understand a little bit more about how the body parser and how middleware actually works, I actually have a video about just that particular topic, to which you're going to find a link to that video down in the description box below. So once again, we have our endpoint set up. We have the post request going to /cars. This is what we're going to be calling the create car method, passing in the rec.body, which is now no longer going to be an empty object. Here we're pretty much going to go to /cars, making a get request to /cars, getting all of those cars, sending back a status code of 200 with a JSON object of cars, where the cars are going to be representing the array of all the cars. Here we're making a patch request to /cars:_ID. So essentially, we want to make sure that the request is going to be /cars/ the actual ID of the car that we're trying to update. And so the way that we're specifying that is by saying /cars/:ID, which now means that we actually go ahead and call the update car, which expects us to pass in an ID of individual car. We can pull that out of the URL by saying rec.params.id. This ID variable name here is going to match up with what we actually specified after the colon in the actual URL. And then the same thing kind of happens within the delete method. The delete car method actually expects us to actually pass the ID of the car that we're trying to delete. So once again, we're going to say we're going to go to /cars/:ID, and then we can call upon rec.params.id to actually go ahead and pull that ID out. And again, this ID here matches whatever has been specified in the colon after what's been specified in the URL after the colon. Now that's actually all the code that we need to kind of build a simple Node REST API. Now let's actually go back to our terminal, run our npm start command, get the server to be fired back up again, and then we can move on over to Postman and start seeing whether or not we can actually go ahead and start executing some of these commands against our cars table in a SQLite database. Okay, so our server is now running on port 1337. Let's head on over to Postman and start executing some of these requests. Okay, so here I am now in Postman. As you can see, I have a post request specified going to HTTP localhost 1337/cars. I've got the body specified of type raw. I'm saying that it's going to be a JSON body. And here you can actually see I'm saying that we're going to have a make of Honda. The model is going to be a CRUD. The year is going to be 2019. Let's go ahead and run this particular request. And if it all works well, we should of course get back ID of 1, which is basically the ID of the newly created car that we just inserted. Which so far it seems like the actual ability to go ahead and post a new car seems to work. But the best way to verify this, of course, is if you move on over to the next tab where we're going to be trying to make a GET request to get all the cars. If we run this particular command, we should of course get back a cars key that's going to be an array of all the cars, which of course in this case is just the one car that we actually just went ahead and created. Now let's actually go ahead and see if we can go ahead and delete a car. If you move on over to the next tab, we're basically saying that we're going to go to /cars/1. That's going to be the ID of the car that we currently have in the database, the one that we want to go ahead and delete right now. If we actually go ahead and run this command now, we see that we get success is equal to true, which means if we now go back to our GET request where we're trying to get all the cars, if we run this now again, we should just get an empty array, which we do, which means that our REST API is actually working exactly as expected. Well, that does it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please drop a like, subscribe, and I'll see you next week in another video.
Perfect.